All right, you've probably heard people talk about realism before. It's one of the most famous theories in international relations, the theory that says the world is a dangerous place, countries compete for power, and conflict is basically inevitable. But here's the twist. That's only one version of realism, because in the late 20th century, scholars took this old idea and rebuilt it. They kept the same basic worldview, power matters, states compete, but they changed why all of this happens. The result was something called neo-realism. And the difference between classical realism and neo-realism is not a small academic tweak. It's a fundamental clash about what really drives world politics. In this video, we will discuss what's the difference between classical realism and neo-liberalism. Let's start with the older tradition, classical realism. Classical realism goes all the way back to thinkers like Thucydides and Machiavelli. Its basic message is simple and very human. Politics is shaped by human nature. Leaders fear threats, crave power, protect their interests, and sometimes miscalculate. Because states are led by humans, they inherit these psychological flaws. So the world becomes a reflection of human ambition, pride, insecurity, and greed. If a leader is aggressive, the country becomes aggressive. If a leader is cautious, the country is cautious. The key variable is human behavior. This is why classical realism spends so much time talking about motives, misperceptions, honor, prestige, the stuff of human emotion. Now enter neo-realism, which basically looked at all that and said, you're overthinking human nature. The real driver is the structure of the international system. Neo-realism argues that world politics looks the way it does, not because leaders are flawed, but because the system forces states into similar patterns of behavior. And the biggest feature of that system is something called anarchy, the fact that no world government exists. No referee, no enforcer, nothing above states that can guarantee their security. So, even if leaders are good people with peaceful intentions, they still have to prepare for the worst. Because in a world without higher authority, survival depends on self-help. This is the heart of neo-realism. States don't compete because they want to. They compete because the structure pushes them to. And this is where the two theories really diverge. Classical realism. Power is sought because humans desire it. Leaders matter. Personality matters. Motives matter. Neo-realism. Power is sought because the system punishes the weak. Leaders don't matter as much. The structure shapes behavior. There's also a major difference in how each theory thinks conflict emerges. Classical realists say conflict often comes from miscalculation, ego, fear, basically human failings. Neo-realists say conflict can happen even when no one intends it. Think of the security dilemma. State A builds weapons for self-defense. State B sees this and assumes the worst, so it builds more weapons. Now State A feels threatened again. No one was greedy. No one was evil, but the system created a spiral of fear anyway. In classical realism, distrust is psychological. In neo-realism, distrust is structural. And of course, there's their very different take on power. Classical realism sees power as an end, a natural expression of human ambition. Neo-realism sees power as a means, a necessary tool for survival. This is why neo-realists obsess over the distribution of power. Is the world unipolar? Bipolar, multipolar, because each structure pushes states toward different patterns of rivalry. Classical realists look at leaders, neo-realists look at systems. So why does this distinction matter today? Because if you're analyzing US-China rivalry, the war in Ukraine, the rise of India, or the tensions in the South China Sea, classical realism will tell you to focus on intentions, ideology, and leaders' personalities. Neo-realism will tell you to focus on the deeper forces, shifting power balances, the logic of survival, and a system that makes competition rational, even when cooperation would be better. One theory explains why people act the way they do. The other explains why states behave similarly, even when people change. Classical realism is a theory of human nature. Neo-realism is a theory of structure. And together they reflect two very different ways of understanding why the world keeps falling into familiar patterns of rivalry and fear, and why, even with new leaders and new ideals, international politics still feels like an old story repeating itself.